For many of us, it is the most important commitment to take care of our loved ones. We need, we feed, as the Beatles song goes, and we work hard to ensure that those close to us are thriving. We do this often without training, support, or even knowing that we've become caregivers. Today, there are 53 million people taking care of their parents, neighbors, or friends, and there are 53 million stories. From the Stanford Center on Longevity, this is When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. I'm your host, Ken Stern. We typically think of caregivers as middle-aged or even older, but in fact, millions of millennials are caregivers, trying to balance work, relationships, and the challenges of caring for loved ones. As we hear in the story of Jesus Trejo, a comedian and caregiver featured in the AARP original movie Care to Laugh.
You worry about your parents. I stress out, it's like I'm raising kids. I feel that's why I'm losing my hair. Look at this, I'm 26 with a comb over, look at that. Like on a windy day, my hair looks like those things outside a car dealership.
Today we consider a generation of young people who have stepped into the role of caregiver much earlier than they expected. We meet a woman who was in her mid-20s when her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. She admits she was unprepared for the way becoming a caregiver would change her life.
I have a friend that jokes with me that the experience I've had during my late 20s is like I got in a time machine, flash forward 20 years, and then came back to tell my friends that, like, guys, we've got to make sure our families are kind of ready to enter this phase of life that's, coming. My name is Libby Brittain. My background on the personal side is as my mom's daughter. I've been a caregiver for my mom for about 5 years now. And it's been the hardest experience I've ever gone through in my life. On the professional side, I actually used to work in technology. During most of the time that kind of the early days that I was a caregiver for my mom, I worked for Facebook, both in New York and in Menlo Park. And more recently, I actually now help other people care for their parents through a business I started called Quilt. At the time my mom got sick, I was living across the country in New York. She was where I grew up in California. And we would talk, I would say most days. We would chat on the phone for a couple minutes, nothing formal. She raised me as a single mom, and I'm an only child. So it was always just the two of us. Our relationship was incredibly close. That does not mean it was always a great relationship, but she was a wonderful mom. And I, despite the fact that I was living all the way across the country, really missed her. And so would do a lot of informal checking in and things on the phone. I had started to notice over sort of a number of years that she had started to change a little bit. I would describe her personality before she got sick as super independent, really sort of vivacious, super chatty. She was a people person. She loved people, loved getting to know someone, whether it was in like the grocery store line or she was an attorney, so it was a part of her work. She worked, got to meet new people all the time. And I noticed her over time starting to sort of withdraw a little bit. That was one of my first signals, actually, that something might be wrong, was that part of her personality had started to change. But I was all the way across the country. At this point, I was in my early 20s, and, we would talk on the phone most days, but, it's hard to know really what's going on with someone unless you're right there with them. I think of my mom as that outgoing, vivacious people person, super independent, always willing to travel on her own. And she started businesses during her career. And she was a wonderful mom. At this point, I was still living on the East Coast and getting progressively more worried. At that point, I had been home for visits a few times. So I usually tried to go home about twice a year. During those visits, I noticed that the house was much more disorganized. So not only was her personality changing, and not only was she isolating herself from her friends, but also there were Post-it notes all over the house with passwords, things I had told her on the phone. So conversations we had little notes basically that she had taken while we were talking. And I also noticed when we talked about her business, she was an attorney that had her own practice for many years prior to getting sick, that she wasn't really developing any more business and she wasn't really completing any of the work that she had. She was talking a lot about how she was really struggling to stay on top of things. And I've got to say, it took me at least a year, maybe 2, to come around to the fact that this might be what we now know as early onset Alzheimer's. And that was really hard to kind of go through over that period of time. It was I felt like crazy at some points because she would have really good days from time to time. And I would think, I would very easily write off all of the sort of concerning things I noticed about her behavior because of this one really good day. But, eventually those really good days started to just be fewer and farther in between. I'm really grateful that I was working for Facebook during this period because they were really great about things like flexible work hours, which makes a huge difference when you have any kind of caregiving responsibility at home, whether it's for kids or, in my case, a parent. So I think I could have been in professional situations that would have made it much harder on me, but one way I like to think about it is I had almost every advantage, right? I was working for this employer that, was incredibly willing to give me these flexible hours that I needed. And even just understanding, my colleagues were always very willing to talk to me about what was going on, but it was still so hard. I was fielding phone calls from my mom during the day at this period, kind of after I had moved home, so a few years after she had started showing real symptoms. She was very paranoid. And so I was getting a lot of phone calls from her during the workday. It was not uncommon for me to run a meeting with 30 people in it, walk out of the room, look down at my phone and see 30 missed calls from my mom. And I'm not really exaggerating on that number. She wouldn't remember that she had already called me 5 times 15 minutes ago. So she would try again and again and again. It's really hard to disengage from the part of you that wants to just pick up the phone immediately and call her right back and try to fix the problem. And if she wants to talk to me or needs to talk to me, it's my responsibility almost as her daughter to call her back. But during that period, I was wrestling, I guess, with how to incorporate the relationship that I had with my mom, given the illness that she now had, into my daily life. I now see that the version of caregiving I've done is on the more extreme end of the spectrum. My mom got very sick very quickly, and there were very few people in her life that could provide the kind of care that she needed. It really was, I think, pretty far away from what most people I knew, especially in my early 20s, mid 20s, what they had ever heard of before happening with anyone in their family, any one of their friends. Caregiver is not a label that I was ever told I should take on. I mainly have, throughout the whole experience, identified as her daughter, actually. And so with doctors, they would sometimes call me a caregiver, and I can remember kind of coming back and saying, no, I'm her daughter. I thought of caregiver in the sense of a professional caregiver, someone who does this work for a living. I was and still am her daughter, and I was there to help as much as I could. But I didn't know that then that I was doing many of the tasks that sort of comprise the work of a family caregiver. So it maybe took me 3 years to say to someone else that I'm my mom's caregiver. And that, again, is even longer than it took me to realize that she was really sick. I've been my mom's financial supporter kind of throughout this whole time for a variety of reasons. She made some bad financial choices as the illness was setting in that meant that not only did I become her primary caregiver, but I also became her financial supporter basically right away. I was looking at the about $5,000 a month I was paying in San Francisco for the type of facility she could live in, inclusive of how big that facility was, how much outdoor space it had, and how many staff members it had. And I was comparing that to actually quite a few other markets, trying to just think about what the best long-term choice was going to be for her. So we compared Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and Phoenix as well, and ultimately found a facility that has taken great care of her for about 2.5 years now in the Phoenix area. But I left Facebook at the end of 2018 with the intention of taking a big right turn in my career and trying to help other families like mine. And I wasn't sure at that point exactly what that would look like or how I would do that, but I felt really confident that, if I had just gone through this process and I felt like there were, that the help I received could have been so much, better, like structured and organized, then I felt like there was an opportunity. So caregiving just sort of reached out and grabbed me in the middle of this other life I was living and kind of didn't let me go. And part of the reason why I've ended up doing this work, honestly, is that I think if I can share my story sort of openly and, certainly through projects like this as well, if we can sort of start talking about caregiving more, I think that will give people more of a sense of comfort with it, and they'll know that it's, most of us will need more help as we get older. That's a normal part of aging, and that's not something to be ashamed of.
Libby Brittain, caregiver for a mother and founder of the consulting company called Quilt. Here to talk with us about how to help a younger generation of caregivers are Amanda Cavaleri, founder of Connect the Ages, a company that connects younger generations to the tradition, value, and wisdom of elders, and Jean Accius, Senior Vice President of Thought Leadership and Global Affairs at AARP. Jean Accius, we tend to think of caregivers as being middle-aged or older, but AARP has written a surprisingly high percentage of unpaid caregivers in the U.S. are millennials, and they face special emotional and professional concerns because of dueling commitments. Tell us about what your research found about millennials caregivers and the challenges they face.
Well, Ken and Amanda, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. It is critically important, in part because of the fact that when we think of family caregivers, we typically think of the average profile of who a family caregiver is. And what we've been able to do at AARP over the last couple of years is really to drill down and really disaggregate the numbers and to really get a better sense as to the heterogeneity that exists, particularly with regards to the family caregiving population. And what we found was that nearly a quarter of all family caregivers are millennials. And this really shattered many people's perceptions of who a millennial is and what they actually do, given some of the stereotypes that's been associated with certain generations. And what we found was the fact that of the nearly 25% of all family caregivers who are millennials, that was more than 10,000 millennials who are providing care to a family member. Oftentimes it was a parent or a grandparent. And what we found across not just the studies that we've done, but also a series of conversations that we've had across the country with millennial family caregivers is that being a caregiver, we know this, is tough for any age group, but it's especially hard for millennials and younger caregivers. And I call it two parts to this. One is that there's a life stage perspective to this, meaning the fact that at the age of 20 or the age of 24 or the age of 25, whatever that millennial age bracket is, one doesn't see themselves in a caregiving situation. Oftentimes millennials are at that stage where they are planning to go off to college or get that next degree, get that new job, potentially start a family. And caregiving for a loved one was not part of that equation. The other aspect of that too is that society doesn't think of millennials caring at such an early age. So I call it a double whammy in the fact that it's really life interrupted, meaning the fact that a lot of the conversations we had with millennial family caregivers was that in many cases they felt isolated. They were providing care and some of their friends could not relate or understand what they were going through. That it really was an emotional, physical, and financial toll for millennials, similar to what we see with other generations, but it also had the magnitude of some of the challenges millennials face, whether it was limited income, whether it's really trying to juggle going to school, going to work, and providing care, was very, very stressful. And where do you turn for help? Was another challenge that we heard from a lot of millennial family caregivers. How do you navigate the healthcare system? How do you coordinate and having to have multiple conversations with different type of providers so to ensure that the person that you're providing care to receive the care that they needed. But we also heard tremendous resiliency and hope among millennial family caregivers, that they knew that providing this type of care gave them a sense of purpose and meaning. They knew that it actually also helped to prevent their loved one from having to go into a nursing home. And then also, quite surprisingly, many millennials felt that the skills that they were learning from their caregiving role could be transferable to other industries and fields. So while there are some challenges, there was also some areas in the conversations and also in the data that spoke to some hope.
So, Amanda, let's pick up on some of the themes that Jean just described. Where do millennials turn to for help when your peer group may not be in the same situation as you are?
It's tough. There are some great resources, like the Alzheimer's Association, for example, is a place that my grandfather had dementia, so our family, received a lot of support through that organization. But it's so fragmented. It's very hard. I think the internet, right? Honestly, the millennial generation looking everything up online. I think there's more of a willingness to incorporate technology or to look for different solutions online. So whether it's prepackaged pills or, different, like even trying baby monitors, there are all sorts of things that millennials are doing differently that feels more natural to them. So I think, trying to incorporate technology, but also knowing if that technology is, safe or not is difficult. And it really also depends a lot on the care provider. So if, for example, if there is a geriatrician that their loved one is seeing, if it's an older adult they're caring for, that's night and day. Sometimes a geriatrician can come in and see the bigger picture, where a lot of older adults might not have access to one because there is such a shortage, or know that that's, aging is such a heterogeneous process as well. So no one person ages the same way. So you can have one issue, or you can have 10 issues that you're facing. And a lot of times it's very hard to separate what is the cause and what's a side effect of a medication. It's really difficult. So I think they can definitely use more resources specific to millennials. It is very isolating.
Let me ask you both about the challenges that younger caregivers face trying to balance employment and caregiving. So one of the, again from AARP, let me start with you, Jean. AARP has found that 73% of millennial caregivers are employed, and they spend an average of 21 hours a week on caregiving. What are the challenges that millennial caregivers face in the workplace? And perhaps what are some of the solutions to those challenges?
Well, that's a great question, Ken. We know that the typical millennial is working in addition to providing care. In some cases, also going to school. They're less likely to report to their supervisor at work that they're in a caregiving role. Similar to many other caregivers, working and providing care could potentially have some implications with regards to your performance at work. We know that in this case, millennials were more likely to receive a warning about their performance or attendance at work, really trying to juggle some of those issues. Millennial family caregivers were more often likely to report high levels of financial strain and financial impact as a result of caregiving, whether it's taking on more debt, leaving bills unpaid, or paying them late, or having to borrow money from family or friends, or being unable to afford basic expenses like food. This is a situation where we really need to think about the cost of caregiving. We know that the average out-of-pocket cost for a family caregiver is roughly about a little bit over $7,000 a year. And that could be anywhere in the tune of about 20% of someone's income. And that doesn't even take into account the cost of long-term care. So there's significant financial implications with providing this type of care. And we also know that millennial family caregivers are just starting off their careers. I think the other thing that is critically important is for employers to think about the opportunity to retain caregivers who might be some of your high performers, and really think about the environment in which the policies or the benefits are being implemented to ensure that caregivers feel that they have the support of their employer, and that there's a culture in which that caregivers can have these candid conversations in terms of what's going on at home.
So, Amanda, let me pick up on some of the themes that Jean described, and also some of the stories that Libby Brittain told, who told about being in a meeting and coming out and finding 30 messages on her cell phone from her mother and having to balance two extraordinary challenges. What have you seen in terms of the challenges millennials face in, at one time, trying to forge a new career, but also taking care of a loved one?
I think Jean brought up a great point earlier as well with, support. It's such an isolating experience to be responsible for another human being outside of your work and your other obligations. It is very hard to find other people to relate to because there are more than 10 million millennial caregivers. Not many see themselves as caregivers, so they don't even know what label to put on themselves to find others. Right? So there's, if I'm a millennial caregiver, how would I find a millennial caregiver support group if I don't even think I'm a caregiver? I'm just helping with my grandmother 20, 30 hours a week. It is, yeah, I think there's always this sense of impending doom, like something's going to happen and it's going to be while I'm in a meeting and I'm coming out and there's 30 messages and it's an emergency, and how do I step away from work to help with this situation without hurting my career trajectory? And it's almost, in some cases almost impossible unless employers really do understand, what's going on at home. But I think caregiving isn't normalized yet, or it's denormalized, right? Over the years, I think it used to be a very normal thing. And so how do we kind of recenter ourselves as employers? Even some larger tech companies are starting to look at caregiving policies as well. And if your staff is supported at home, they're going to be much more productive and they're going to be more valuable and bring their best game to the office instead of having this weight on them all the time. So I think we'll start to see new models out of business, and that's coming a lot faster, I think, than it would have without COVID. I think COVID's an accelerant to a lot of these things. I think the future of work is going to change dramatically. So as the future of work changes, employers will have to adapt, and that might mean that more people are caring for their loved ones. I think things are going to change quite a bit over the next 10 years, especially, maybe even just 5.
So, Amanda, one of the things you said in there relates something to Libby said. So Libby said, as you just heard, for several years she didn't even identify herself as a caregiver. And she was taking her mother to the doctor as her daughter, and actually reacted somewhat negatively when she was described as a caregiver. That sounds like a fairly typical description. How do you help millennials? How do you normalize the conversation with a population as large as millennials and Generation Z?
Yeah, I think it's more around framing, kind of like what we're doing with COVID, right? We're saying, do you have a fever? We're not saying, do you have COVID? Like, do you take your grandmother? Yeah, do you fill your grandmother's prescriptions and take her to the doctor every now and then and maybe spend 10 hours a week with her? You're probably a caregiver. So it's kind of looking more at the actions than the label, I think. So if we could really master that, what are they putting into Google? How do I fill my grandmother's pills? How do I think if we can kind of play the game with the algorithms that are at hand, I think if we're speaking to them on the actions that they do rather than the label of a caregiver, that's much more relatable. I don't know that they'll ever call themselves caregivers.
So, Jean, Amanda said a number of interesting things there, including the fact that COVID may be a pivot point for a lot of things, but perhaps how we start thinking about the organization of families, our responsibilities of family. What do you see happening in the post-COVID world if and when we get to it?
In terms of COVID, as Amanda indicated, it is the great accelerator. I think that COVID has illustrated many of the deficiencies in our health and long-term care systems that drastically need to be addressed. COVID did not create some of these issues. It has just amplified it, meaning that these issues have been long-standing. So the question is, where do we go from here? On one hand, we can basically say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and put some patchwork solutions to what is very deep-wounded issues and worry about it next time. Or we can be bold and courageous and say, you know, enough is enough. These are systemic issues that drastically need to be addressed. What we're seeing in the long-term care industry right now with respect to nursing homes is outrageous. The fact that nursing home residents are not able to have virtual visits with their families in some cases because there's not the equipment available should make anyone upset. I think that COVID-19 has also given us the opportunity to think big because this is a huge pandemic and incremental solutions just not going to be adequate of a response to the magnitude of what all of us are being impacted by. So I do think that we're going to have to think about some very innovative solutions that will require some partnerships across unlikely partners across industries to really meet this human moment. And if we really care about what it means to create a system that puts the person and their family in the center of that system, now's the time to start having those conversations.
Amanda Cavaleri, we've been talking about some of the challenges and advice we'd give to a millennial caregiver. What do you say to them about the opportunities? What does caregiving bring to a younger person?
I think it brings so much. You know, we have as young people, we have such a small perspective, right? We've only been on this planet a couple decades. We haven't seen these big macro swings the way that older generations have. Sometimes things that feel very intense, you know, we don't really label as temporary, which older generations can give us that more macro perspective and really help us see the value in going through tough times or in enjoying getting the most out of the good times. I think that macro perspective is huge. Also, you know, that I think there is something to skipping a generation in the middle, and there's more of an unconditional type of a relationship, or there can be, compared to if I were caring for my mother, I think it'd be different than caring for my grandmother. So there are these very soft skills and interpersonal skills that I think younger people are especially hungry for right now, with all of our Zoom meetings or whatever it might be. I think the high-tech, low-touch world we're living in with COVID is helping us realize the value of like deep, meaningful relationships, which I think are mainly what older people try to focus on. So it's actually, I think, a pretty perfect combination for what's going on with COVID. And we're all feeling a bit, I think, I won't speak for all millennials, but I know myself and most of my friends at some point during this have felt pretty isolated and have either felt anxious or depressed or, you know, very uncertain. So I think that macro perspective, I've seen it before, doing some disaster relief work after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. There were a bunch of bees that were just falling to the ground because the trees were gone. Their habitat was gone, so the bees were just dying. And, you know, younger people they're like, this is the end of the world, this is it. And the older people are like, whoa, don't panic. All this is, you know, the winds blew their home away. So just, they'll come back, but give them a couple of years to get to where they were. But, you know, it's a scary, if you don't have that context, you don't know, or, you know, where do we get water? How do we get by without our cell phones, without Googling things for a month? Like, these are very, you know, very difficult things to learn if you've never gone without that or you don't know any better. And I think, older generations, especially once you get closer to the centenarians. So when people are in their 90s and early hundreds, there's a certain sense of like resilience. So I actually went for AARP and filmed some stories of longevity in Sardinia and a couple other places, which is a blue zone. And there's really something special about people that make it over the age of 90. I think a lot of it is attitude. And so having that resilient, positive attitude, to be able to pass that down to a younger person, and for us as younger people to be able to see, what type of life you can have if you have the right type of attitude. You get to see the result of someone's life by the attitudes they've lived their lives with and the actions they've taken. And we get to learn from their mistakes. We don't have to make all the mistakes they did. We get to take it in and maybe, accelerate our time so we can do more with the time that we have while we're here. And that alone is a huge, huge gift, to be able to have their successes and their failures and their lessons passed down to us, and we can do with that hopefully what will make our lives better.
That's Amanda Cavaleri, founder of Connect the Ages, and Jean Accius, Senior Vice President of Thought Leadership and Global Affairs at AARP. Today's show was produced by Carrie Thompson with production assistance from Ellie Wartell. Please leave us a review on iTunes, and you can find out more about us by visiting our website, longevity.stanford.edu. You've been listening to When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ken Stern.